Hello, this is your third lesson revising A Christmas Carol. Now remember, these lessons are designed to just revise key elements of the text. It assumes that you have already read the book and studied it initially, which of course we all did last year in school. So as always, we're going to begin with some vocabulary. We are going to revise avarice. So think to yourself, what do we mean by avarice? And can you think of an example of Scrooge's avarice in the novel? My clue is that avarice is a sin. It is something negative. Last lesson, we looked at this idea of liberality. Can you remember any characters that are presented as having liberality in the novel? We saw one in the last lesson we revised. And our new word is forbearance. So forbearance is showing a patient self-control, restraint or tolerance. So if you are very forbearant, you're very patient, you're quite tolerant of other people, you're not quick to lose your temper. So can you pause the video please and quickly jot down that definition? So think about then what we read in our last revision lesson when we looked at Fred inviting Scrooge for Christmas dinner. How does Fred show forbearance towards Scrooge then? So you can pause the video and answer those three questions. So avarice is a fancy word for greed, essentially. So Scrooge's avarice in the novel is presented through his obsession with monetary gain, his obsession with gaining more money, even though he never spends it himself. He's very selfish, very greedy, doesn't want to give to charity, doesn't pay Bob a decent wage, doesn't view that it is his responsibility to support the poor. Liberality, meaning generosity. Fred is very generous. Fezziwig, Scrooge's boss that we see in stave 2, or his first boss at least, Fezziwig, shows generosity. The charity workers, who we're going to revise today, definitely show liberality. So Fred shows forbearance towards Scrooge because he patiently keeps his temper in the face of basically Scrooge's outright rejection of him and his rudeness towards him. But Fred never once loses his temper, and he vows to Scrooge that even though he's never done anything to fall out with Scrooge, every year in the spirit of Christmas, he will come and he will try and make contact with Scrooge and offer him the opportunity to be with his family at Christmas. So again, liberality and forbearance were seen as very positive qualities, very Christian qualities, because remember, Dickens, as would society at the time in the 1840s, have been very religious. Avarice, on the other hand, is a sin. We know that this is a book about Scrooge going from unrepentant sinner to somebody who is prepared to accept the error of their ways and to improve. So our knowledge goal today is to revise how Dickens presents his social views through the charity workers and Jacob Marley. So we're going to reread the section on the charity workers. We're then going to reread some of the important sections where Jacob Marley visits Scrooge at the end of stave 1. We're going to think about how Dickens presents his views on society through the charity workers and through Jacob Marley, and how these sets of characters link to Dickens' intentions in writing this novel. Now, we know Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol to change the way the rich viewed the poor. That is his fundamental intention. We know he felt very strongly about the inequality in society because of his own experiences of poverty as a child. He knew that anybody, no matter how good or decent they are only one unlucky incident away from falling on hard times, from being plunged into poverty, and he knows firsthand how horrendous that is. So all of his novels, including A Christmas Carol, challenge that 19th century sort of perspective that if you are poor, it is somehow your fault. It means that you are lacking, that you are a bad person. So how does he show that? Through the charity workers and through Jacob Marley. So I am going to do sort of some switching backwards and forwards with the visualizer here. We're going to look at the charity workers. We're going to think about how they're presented and how they present Dickens' views. So hopefully this should seamlessly transfer over. Okay. Here we are. This lunatic, so they're talking about Fred, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. So these are the charity workers. They were portly gentlemen. Now, portly simply means that they were slightly overweight. And remember, you know, in Victorian times, a little bit like Mr. Burling, this is a sign of their wealth. So these are, you know, pretty well-off, wealthy gentlemen. Pleasant to behold. So they're, you know, they're not necessarily, you know, drop dead gorgeous, but they've got, you know, pleasant, nice, warm, opening faces. They look friendly and now stood with their hats off, so they're being respectful, in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands and they bowed to him. So our overall impression, whilst they may be rich, is that actually they're pleasant, they're respectful. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe, said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Now remember, even though Marley's been dead for 7 years, Scrooge never changed the sign in the front of the house of his shop. Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years, Scrooge replied. He died 7 years ago this very night. Now there's a little bit of foreshadowing here. This idea that Jacob Marley is going to appear to Scrooge on the anniversary of his death. We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner, said the gentleman presenting his credentials. So what they're doing here is they're making a very ignorant assumption that Jacob Marley, when he was alive, was generous, and Scrooge is in fact generous too. Now we know already as the reader that this is completely ridiculous. Scrooge is the complete opposite. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. So Scrooge and Marley are just as bad as one another. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. Now, if something's ominous, then it makes you wary or concerned. So Scrooge hears the word liberality or generosity, frowns and thinks, oh yeah, no, I don't want anything to do with this. At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking up a pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comfort, sir. So what we have here is these 2 men are going around all the local businesses asking wealthy people to donate to the poor at Christmas, because there are thousands that need basic necessaries to live and hundreds of thousands that just want a little something extra to celebrate Christmas. Now, what Dickens is subtly doing here is he's opening his readers' eyes, and remember, his readers would have been rich, to the fact that there are thousands and in fact hundreds of thousands in this country that live nowhere near as decent a life and as comfortable a life as they do. So there's a subtle sort of message here. Are there no prisons? Asked Scrooge. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. And the union workhouses. Excuse me, demanded Scrooge. Are they still in operation? Now, workhouses, we've talked about workhouses a lot. Workhouses were essentially slave labour camps for the poor. They were created by the government due to the Poor Law in 1834, and they were there to deal with the massive poverty and homelessness and crime on the streets. The idea of a workhouse is that if you were destitute, if you were poor, if you couldn't, survive, you could voluntarily choose to go to a workhouse. Now, in return for allowing you to live there and feed you, you would have to work. And may think, oh, well, okay, maybe that's not too unreasonable, but it's the conditions in which they had to work in, the long hours, the type of work they had to do, the fact that they were split up from their husbands, their children, all in different workhouses, the fact that they were fed gruel, you know, disgusting food that could just about keep them alive, the fact that they would have shared a bed in a big dormitory. It would have been utterly horrendous and humiliating. So the fact that Scrooge says prisons and workhouses, linking to this idea of the poor needing help, shows, again, a very disgusting, abhorrent attitude. But it was an attitude that many of the readers would have shared at the time, and we know Dickens is counteracting and trying to make those people change this attitude that Scrooge displays here. So this is an incredibly important part of the book. They are still, returned the gentleman. I wish I could say they were not. So what we see here is Dickens using the charity workers, a bit like Fred in our previous lesson, to put forward his views in society. Because of his own experiences working in the blackening factory and the fact that his dad and mum and younger siblings were all put in a debtor's prison, which was like a workhouse, only you were forced to go there because you were in debt, he absolutely loathed the whole concept of debtors' prisons and workhouses. He thought they were not a support for the poor. They were absolutely, you know, a form of discrimination against the poor and exploitation of the poor. The treadmill and the poor law are still in full vigour then, said Scrooge. So that's again referring to the law passed in government that created these workhouses and debtors' prisons. Both very busy, sir. So what we have here again is Dickens' dig at society. Yes, they're absolutely full of people because these people have no choice. Scrooge says, oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their youthful course, said Scrooge. I'm very glad to hear it. So the fact that Scrooge thinks workhouses and debtors' prisons are good things shows his massive ignorance to what it's really like to be poor, but again is making him even more dislikable, which is of course Dickens' intentions here. Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, returned the gentleman, a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund, so some money, to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. So they do not view the workhouses as something that is Christian. They go against Christian teachings. And again, this is something Dickens believed as well. If you look at the story of Jesus, and we've got to remember that Jesus, the New Testament, is essentially the biggest part of the Bible that Christians, you know, focus on. Jesus was the ultimate champion of the poor. You know, one of the reasons he was viewed as such a radical and viewed as such a danger to the Roman Empire powers at the time is because he was not necessarily wanting society to revolt, but he was absolutely sticking up for the rights of the poor and supporting the poor and vulnerable in society. So this whole idea that you can create a workhouse as a supposed support for the poor, to, you know, what Dickens is saying is that if you are a Christian, if you believe, you know, in Jesus Christ, our saviour, and everything he did when he was here on earth to redeem us of our sins, how can you possibly think God or Jesus would look at the workhouses and think that they are morally right? So again, we've got Dickens using people's Christian beliefs to try and get and provoke an emotional reaction out of them. So they're trying to, you know, raise some funds to give the poor some meat and drink at Christmas. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. Now, this is really important as well, particularly as we know we're going to meet two symbolic children called ignorance and want. Now, we have want interpreted in two ways. Here, want is desperate need, like these poor people are in desperate need of food, clothing, shelter. But you can also interpret want in terms of avarice, of greed. The riches want, or rich people's want and desire and avarice for more money, you know, for more money all the time. I read an article last night, interestingly, well, very depressingly, 7 million people died of hunger in 2020 globally. 77 million people. And that is staggering when you think they died because they didn't have enough to eat. And as any Western person who probably regularly chucks unwanted or uneaten food in the bin, that is something we should probably think quite deeply about. So we cannot kid ourselves for 1 minute that we don't still have these same issues that exist in our society today. Look at the scandal at the moment in the news over what the government deem appropriate for food packages that are being sent home to families. You know, it takes a footballer to actually try and campaign and show, do you know what, this is pretty disgusting. How do you think a family can survive on this? So that's what Dickens is talking about here when he talks about want. Want isn't, oh, well, I'd like a new iPhone, I'd like a new pair of boots. Want is, I want to be able to clothe my children. I want to be able to put wood on the fire to keep them warm through a winter's night. I want to be able to put food in their bellies. And Christmas, when you don't have what you need, you feel it even more keenly. It's even more depressing. And abundance, people who have a lot, people who are rich, they are the ones able to celebrate Christmas here. Oh, there goes my book. So Dickens is again creating a very strong message here that the difference between those that have a lot and those that have a little is made even more stark at Christmas, which is of course why he chooses to set this book at Christmas. So they say to Scrooge, what shall I put you down for? So how much money shall I put you down for? Scrooge says nothing. You wish to be anonymous. So they're like, oh, you don't want to have your name put to it. And Scrooge says, I wish to be left alone. So again, showing his misanthropic attitude. He doesn't want anything to do with this situation. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. Now, idle means lazy. And remember, the rich viewed the poor as lazy. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough. And those who are badly off must go there. The establishments, he's talking about the workhouses and the debtors' prisons. Those who are poor, you know, those who are badly off, they should go there. What he means by I help to support, he means his taxes, of which he has no choice. Believe me, if Scrooge thought he could get away with not paying taxes, I'm sure he would. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Now, I'm sure this is a quotation you can remember from last year. He's saying, who cares if the poor die? If they're going to die, let them die. Get rid of the surplus population. He views the poor as unnecessary to society. They are, in fact, a burden on society, and he couldn't care less if they laid down and died. And when he says, besides, excuse me, I don't know that, he's saying, well, I don't know if that's true. What, you're telling me they'd rather die than go to a workhouse? That's ridiculous. I don't believe it. But you might know it, observed the gentleman. Now, what we have here is, again, Dickens referring to ignorance. Scrooge is making an ignorant comment about the poor, and it's ignorant because he's talking about something he thinks he understands, but he does not. He doesn't know what it's like to be them. And the gentleman is saying, you might know it if you visited a workhouse, if you walked amongst the poor, if you opened your eyes, you might know it. But Scrooge says, it's not my business. And again, so many people have that attitude today. Not my business, got nothing to do with me, not interested in opening my eyes or having empathy or sympathy for these people. Not my business, not interested. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. So he's saying it's a bit, again, like Mr. Burling, this every man for himself, very individualist attitude. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen, and he dismisses them. Seeing clearly it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labours with an improved opinion of himself and in a more facetious temper, more of a bad temper than was usual with him. So what I'm going to do now is switch back, hopefully, to our PowerPoint. And we're going to do some work based on what we've just read. Once I load it up. As we're already quite a little bit way into the lesson, I'm going to just focus on the charity workers today. And what we'll do in tomorrow's lesson is we'll focus on Jacob Marley separately, I think, because I appreciate that some people are finding it a little bit tricky to keep up with the pace and the sheer amount of work that is being set. So I'm going to try my best to make these revision lessons a little bit shorter if I can. So we're just going to focus on the charity workers, then we'll stop and we'll focus on Jacob Marley tomorrow. So how are the charity workers presented? I would like you to pause the video, gather a few quotations. One has been done for you. They're portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold. So gather a couple of quotations and then just write a brief summary. You don't have to mini PE. How are the charity workers presented? You know, think about what they want to do, why they're there, what does it tell us about them, you know, why, and if you want to challenge yourself, you know, if you're aiming for the higher grades, why has Dickens chosen to present the charity workers in this way? Think about the way they contrast or juxtapose Scrooge. Think about the way they may represent Dickens' own attitudes. So pause the video, find some quotations, and then write a summary on how they're presented. And if you want to challenge yourself, think about why Dickens has chosen to present them in this way. So the next question I want you to have a look at, how do the charity workers view the poor? And I've picked one quotation to help you, but you may want to look again and just sort of reread the section. We should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at this time. So how does that quotation tell us how the charity workers view the poor, or use any other evidence from that extract I've just read to you on the visualizer to justify your views? And again, if you want to challenge yourself, you can add to your explanation, how does this attitude juxtapose or compare to Scrooge's attitude to the poor? So finally, what wider message is Dickens giving in this extract? And you've got a sentence starter there to help you. So think about the purpose of this extract. What wider message about society, about the rich and the poor and their attitudes to one another is Dickens giving? And how can you link this to Dickens' own beliefs? So again, in green here, if you need it, you have two sentence starters to help you. Again, if you're aiming for the higher grades, you may want to add in a bit of evaluation. How successful is Dickens in conveying or showing his social beliefs to the reader? So if you're aiming for those sorts of 7s and above or 6s and above, you may want to add in that evaluation. So, as I said, I'm going to stop there. Tomorrow we'll do the second half of this lesson and we'll have a look at Jacob Marley and we'll have a look at the purpose of Jacob Marley. As always, if you have any questions, do please email your class teacher and I'll see you tomorrow.